Welcome back to Season 2 of Defence Talks, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. This season, we continue to explore the key questions that shape defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK, and also unpack the main themes in British defence in the context of intensifying geopolitical competition. However, it's not only me guiding you through these questions, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by my colleague Paul.
Hi, Victoria, and it's been a busy couple of weeks, hasn't it? Well, a couple of months in defence innovation and spending. We've got the 2.2 billion extra on the defence budget announced in the spring statement. We've got a new National Armaments Director, acting NAD as we call it, that role. Government's signalled the creation of UK defence innovation, which we're going to be talking about, what we can speak about and what we know of it today. And another 2 billion from Rachel Reeves on UK Export Finance's direct lending capacity for defence. So it's clearly a boom time for the industry. The question is whether it's a successful boom time for UK innovation, both in the private sector, in the military, and in government.
Absolutely, and today's topic is Driving Defence Innovation, a UK-wide endeavour. And we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Dan Sawyers and also Rob Merryweather. So let's perhaps introduce our guests today.
So Lieutenant Colonel Dan Sawyers is a serving military officer and head of the UK Strategic Command's innovation team at jHub, a role he assumed in November 2022. Rob Merryweather is BAE Systems Group Technology Director and part of the Chief Technology Office at the Global Prime. And we'll be speaking to both of you about your mastermind specialist subject, I hope, which is how do we get the most out of the innovation process and the innovation structures in UK defence?
So, welcome both, and perhaps let's begin with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I think there are many lessons which we've learned in the past couple of years and months, and perhaps we can start our conversation with how has the innovation, the speed of innovation and the speed of relevance of innovation been unfolding in this context of the ongoing war in Ukraine?
Yeah, so firstly, a huge thanks to the Council on Geostrategy for having me here today. It's very humbling to be asked to participate in platforms such as these. And I just would like to say a huge thank you to my team up front who do all the hard work and obviously provide me with the evidence and the ability to come and chat here today. I think the first point I would make on this is that innovation power or innovation advantage derives from the ability to invent, adopt and adapt new solutions. And it is that ability to continuously do that faster and better that creates advantage. And I think nowhere more in the last couple of years have we seen that really at pace in both Ukraine and Russia as well. So both sides iterating now, everything down from 18 months to 12 months to 6 months to 3 months to a matter of weeks. It is just unparalleled and unseen before. And I think there's a couple of things there that sort of stand out for me. Firstly, and necessity aside, I think we all realise that when there's a conflict on, things move a lot quicker than they normally would. But I think the things that have really stood out for me, it is that shift to mass, low cost and attrition. That's really sped things up. And I know we might come back later to some discussion around what's the right balance between that nature of equipment versus more exquisite long-term platforms as well. But I think that's been a key part. The other bit I think is that capacity, desire and willingness, and again that necessity to change what we call tactics, techniques and procedures as well. That ability to receive 60% prototype capability on the battlefront, not only therefore able to iterate and help develop that piece of equipment to innovate, but to innovate in their own ways and our technologies find new and novel ways, which in turn begets more innovation and new requirements and new ways to adapt as well. And I think the third point, which I think is a key part of this discussion, and I think will come out later on sort of the UK defence innovation pieces, it has demonstrated, and certainly from a Russian perspective, how quickly and how well they can scale up their innovations. And I think critical going forward from a UK perspective and a European perspective, and a Western, I suppose, is how we create that industry base that can scale and sustain the demands of modern conflict.
It's those on the front line and those close to the front line describe, for example, the most recent, most obvious thing that's going on the Ukrainian front line is the arrival of fiber optically controlled drones. And this seems to be something that the Ukrainians innovated themselves. Now I think both sides are doing it. You're now seeing battlefield injuries from fiber optic cable. There is so much of it around. What can either of you tell us about the specific challenge of, we're sitting here in the UK with a very established, very rules-orientated industry and commissioning organisation, the MOD, and the Ukrainians are sitting there with 60 different brigades, often innovating in their own style. How do we learn from that? Because you sitting in a head office of a huge defence prime, and you sitting there at UK Stratcom, you've got to at some point say, well, how much of this could we ever do ourselves?
I think first of all, that's a great element of this debate, to understand how we take the appropriate elements of that learning and roll that into what we do. You see the processes we take as industry to work alongside that in supporting Ukraine. And in that world, it is absolutely about getting as close as we can inside that feedback loop of understanding what the challenges are, what the shortfalls in the equipment are, what the latest threats are, and what is often, in fact always, what is the simplest change that we can make that allows us to overcome the new challenge or the new element in that arms race. So I think there's a massive lesson around simplicity in this, in terms of how do you find the quickest, fastest way of moving that forwards. When we look at what does that look like in the context of maybe how the UK reshapes its forces, and how do we prepare the UK to engage in hopefully not, but potentially a more direct role in any future conflict in Europe. I think there is a huge thing about understanding the risk appetite and shifting the risk balance that we have become used to in a Cold War, post-Cold War era. Because we've always, or in recent times, we've taken the view of how do we certify something to accept a minimum level of risk in what is broadly a peacetime or an expeditionary warfare environment. In a context where the other side of the risk appetite or the risk equation is an adversary who has greater capability, and how do we counter that greater capability, and that is actually the primary threat, then we need to shift our risk position in terms of how we assure, approve, release into service these capabilities more quickly, because there are things that we've done historically as a UK and a Western ecosystem as a whole that are unsustainable at the pace of change that we would need if you had an existential conflict such as the Ukraine is facing.
And there's a huge mass of learning that we're very fortunate, I think, to extract back from Ukraine at the moment, and that is being sort of adopted, incorporated into the current UK ways of thinking, and we are starting to see some of that adaptation take place, and I think we'll see that come through strong and heavy in the strategic defence review as well. We're also learning from what we're doing in terms of our own approaches to support Ukraine as well. So for some of sort of the initiatives that exist to help position and donate kit and equipment forward, there are elements of that which I think will inform our future approaches to equipment procurement, capability acquisition and innovation. But I think we also need to be careful. There's elements of those which won't necessarily work for UK defence. We still need to think about what we define as defence lines of development or the integration pathway, and we couldn't simply always move as quickly as we do in support of Ukraine. But just to pick up on that last point, that risk point is key as well, and that's why I think there's great opportunity now within the innovation ecosystem and the framework, because I think it provides an excellent sort of a sandbox or environment where you can take that risk and push the boundaries of risk, and then rapidly take that learning into the more substantial equipment procurement decisions that we make going forward.
So to try and concretise this for our non-specialist listeners and viewers, so it is said that, first of all, I'm not aware that there is a certification process for some of the kit that the Ukrainians are producing. I mean, they literally make them in a garage and ship them out. But beyond that, I mean, it is said that they use, for example, routinely chips from Chinese electronics, which I don't think BAE Systems would be rushing to install something from a Chinese transistor radio in one of your capabilities. So, is there a danger we get sort of mesmerised by the the achievements of the Ukrainians, and that we, likewise, you mentioned, Dan, mass, low cost, and attrition. Is there a danger we get sucked into thinking that we might fight an attritional war, because a lot of people in the British military don't want to be fighting anything like an attritional war?
Yeah, I think there is a massive truism that we prepare to fight the last war, and therefore I think the thought process around the balance between learning the lessons from Ukraine but not over-learning the lessons from Ukraine is very much a narrative that is very, very live. There are some things which are a clear demonstration of an evolution of warfare that is enabled by technology or is enabled by new tactics, which we would expect to see endure. And there are other things which are a very specific response to a specific set of circumstances of the force mix that Ukraine has. It's been provided from multiple international sources, how to knit that together into the most effective fighting force that they can. But that would look very different to the mobilisation of an existing mature fighting force here, such as you would expect to see within a NATO environment with collaborative nations who have spent tens of years understanding how to interoperate with each other. So that dynamic of how to learn but how to not overlearn, but to genuinely not overweight either side of that argument, because it's easy to think, well, actually that's just the Ukraine. No, there is a lot of very key learning that will be highly relevant. Equally, to your point, there will be some things which are just how Ukraine will fight and we would fight differently. And I think we need to constantly challenge ourselves to pick the middle path through those two positions.
Yeah, there's a good senior officer saying in defence at the moment that, and I'm sure used by others, so I won't necessarily just label the senior officers, if you squint hard enough, you can learn any lesson from Ukraine at the moment. I mean, that's not to diminish what's happening out there and the fantastic effort that's taken place. But as just said, we've got to find that balance. And I recognise that sometimes that will create a tension, because there will be demand signals out from industry and academia that we should be going faster or we should take in a different route. And in defence, it is about getting that balance right. And the war dev centres that are across Stratcom and Defence at the moment, and that will now support the new Mill Strat headquarters, are working incredibly hard and at pace to work out what those future requirements are. And I think this term will come out a lot during this podcast. It is that constant tension between being in contact, the fight tonight, versus our ability to pull through fully transformational capabilities and processes.
So when it comes to defence innovation, quite often we hear scale, speed, these words usually accompany defence innovation. How do we scale up at speed when it comes to defence innovation? What is the recipe?
I don't think there is one recipe. I think it depends on the capability that we're talking about. But I think it starts with understanding the value of the thing that you choose to scale. And I think that plays into, we're seeing a much bigger role in experimentation than we have done previously. We're seeing a much bigger role in taking 2 or 3 capabilities into an initial, it's not even a deployment, but operationally relevant experimentation. And that builds the confidence to get behind a thing, because then you can put the effort into scaling something with the confidence that there's been customer engagement, it's been tested, yes, there's been some learning, and we need to keep that agility. So I don't think you can underestimate the start point of scaling and making sure that you scale things with confidence. I think there is then a huge part that comes back to that argument about simplicity. The simpler something is, the easier it is to scale. So that is a wonderful engineering term. An engineer hasn't finished when he has concluded everything he can think of in the product. It's when he has removed everything that can possibly be removed while it still performs its task. So driving to simplicity of solution massively helps with then the ability to scale. And then I think there are more foundational things that we can start to look at over time. So what are the elements of commonality? What are the things that we can scale once and use many times? So we talked about the Chinese components, and I really genuinely don't think that risk can be underestimated. So when we look at the complexity of some of the cyber resilience attacks in the supply chain, inputting latent defects into the supply chain that can later be acted and enabled. We've got case studies of things that have been years in the making in that space. So there are elements of that supply chain we need to be super careful of. If you take drones and quadcopters, well, let's take an example like electric motors. If we can onshore supply manufacture of electric motors, then that is a scaled capability that can then be leveraged by anyone at a higher position in that supply chain. So I think understanding some of those enabling capabilities, those enabling products that appear many times in many different places, and doing structural scaling of those, then provides a foundation for this rapid innovation on top of that to make the minor modifications and the tweaks and the changes to keep up with the arms race.
Yeah, I fully agree with everything Rob just says there, and it sort of aligns with an approach that we take. And we define it as, being free but connected. So connected in every way that Rob's just described. Ultimately there could be a understanding collectively what the demand signal or the problem set is. The innovation community stepping away slightly from the main body, conducting its period of experimentation, exploration, and then knowing where to dock back into the bigger system at the right points. And having that pathway and that acceptance agreed, the ability to come into funding lines or into programs. Tick VG. In reality, that doesn't work. There'll always be a tension and an abrasion there. And there's just a couple of other things, therefore, which I think allow the innovation team to be free and then constructively disrupt the bigger system. And it's normally down to leadership and funding that allow you to sometimes just break back into that process that you've laid out and effectively, I know this is what we agreed last week, but now we know this week. How do we fit it in? And normally it requires some strong leadership and maybe some money just to sort of soften and grease rules.
I think, I don't think it's a simple lift and shift, these things never are, but I think, there's a lot of learning you can take from, how organisations like, the consumer electronics market works. So if you look behind the scenes of an Apple or Samsung on their smartphone development, we as consumers see, an S22, then an S23, then an S24, and then we'll see an S22 Plus and whatever else. But we tend to see these things as sequential releases. If you look behind the scenes, there'll be 4 or 5 of those models in development at any one point in time. And what's sequential is the point that you drop them in. I think in defence we have historically a simplistic view of that says I make a thing, then I ask for a change, and then I wait for that change and I get the next thing. We've got to get smarter about being able to have multiple changes in work, but then to your point, understanding very consciously when you put those in a way that isn't disruptive to the supply. I think that maintains the volume. Yeah,
that last bit spot on, and I think it comes back to those Ukraine allies. It is sometimes it's less about the technology, and in fact, it is less about the technology. It is about our capacity to innovate continuously, whether that's in a streamlined sort of really functional, clear process or a slightly unwavy process. What are the straight lines we need horizontally, but the skills vertically that allow us to dip in and out of the process?
A couple of the talks that I've attended recently. You've had senior military professionals talking about bringing, for example, Formula One type development, where they start with the car on race 1, but by the race 3, it's evolved. The other discipline is fintech. We had a great example of fintech guys being brought in to revolutionise one particular aspect for the Royal Air Force's capability. How much of the UK engineering back end is capable of reacting at that kind of speed? Because these examples are quite unusual for, if you think about, let's not call it metal bashing, but the classic UK engineering, automotive, aerospace. It doesn't work normally at a Formula One speed, does it?
I would counter that. I think there is a huge capacity in the industry base to work and respond in that way, and that isn't historically new. As defence industry, we have always had urgent operational requirements. We've always had things that are done within a slightly different clearance regime, with a slightly different risk appetite, with a very clear need, operational need that drives that pace of change. So I think the capability is there. I mean, if I give you another example, when COVID first hit. We mobilised the UK industry base on the whole, and as defence, we came up with and released designs for respirators in 8 weeks. To something that we had never seen before. It was never a challenge we put ourselves to, but we could take that clear alignment around an operational imperative and do a novel design very, very quickly. Now, fortunately, that didn't need to scale. The environment turned out differently, but it got us to that place. So I think the fundamentals are absolutely there. I think what is different is the environment and the ecosystem that those businesses work in. And if you go back to that F1 example, That's exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Each of those iterations, a new rear wing, McLaren might be working on a new rear wing for several months. They will plan when they're going to bring those aero upgrades, and what we see is actually it's an upgrade this week, it's an upgrade this week, it's an upgrade the following race. And we tend to believe that upgrade has taken a week from when they did the last one to when they do the next one. It hasn't. It's taken a few months. Now, they work at pace and they're fantastic at it. But it's getting what you were talking about that cycle of innovation and understanding when to drop these things in such that the capability continually iterates, but actually there is adequate timeline to make these significant developments and capability enhancements.
Paul, following on your question, it looks like to me that there's a growing overlap between the military technology development and civilian technologies development. So is this the case? And also, if this is the case, what are the implications?
Yeah, very much so, and I think we'll come onto it in a bit. It was kind of one of the reasons why the jHub sort of stood up, really, because of that growing recognition in what we may define as the dual use or commercial technology innovation. Arguably, it's where the leading technologies now, AI, quantum, autonomy, they're all taking place in the commercial sector. They're being led by the commercial sector, and they've shown that they have huge applicability, not just in what you might call the front pointy end of defence, but actually when you start to think about defence resilience, defence sustainment, and maintaining force power, there's significant crossover in those technologies as well, and therefore there's an imperative on us to work with those that are experts and SMEs in that area, show that humility that is where the real knowledge is, and how do we bring that in and adopt it and use it alongside defence. Yeah,
absolutely, I completely agree. The overlap is absolutely growing. If you just look at the scale of private investment that's coming out of VC communities into capabilities that are relevant to defence. You look at Starlink with Elon Musk, etc. There's huge investment going into these areas, and there is absolutely relevance into defence. From our side, I think we see that driving two things. One, it drives us to work very closely with a lot of the players in that space, whether that's huge organisations like Microsoft, or whether that's the startups that are there innovating for fintech, and there is actually an awful lot to learn from fintech that is relevant. So there's that element of understanding that ecosystem and working with the different organisations. The other thing that we see increasingly, though, is there are almost always some elements that are specific to defence, where you need some tailoring, you need some additional resilience, you need some feature that isn't driven by the commercial market. So understanding how we can layer those things on top of those underpinning commercial technologies is something that we're increasingly looking at, and then how we bring forward something that is truly effective in that contested, congested operational environment, but benefits from the often billions of pounds of investment that can go into commercial tech.
Dan, you've briefly referred to jHub, and that's of course the organisation which you run. Could you please elaborate a bit more what the organisation is about and when was it launched?
Yeah, absolutely. So the jHub was established 2017. It sits within UK Strategic Command, which for those not familiar is one of sort of the four commands that sits within Defence alongside Navy, Army and Air. And Stratcom is predominantly responsible for generating Defence's joint capabilities. So everything from our specialist user, our medical services, Defence intelligence, infrastructure, Defence digital, etc. And some of that will change under Defence reform. So the jHub was established predominantly to serve that user base, but actually took a broader remit to serve across Defence. I think we sort of touched on many of the reasons as to why the jHub was established, which was in response to the growing sort of geopolitical tension, uncertainty, but as importantly, and if not more influential, sort of the rapid technological change that was taking place outside of defence. And we had a conventional process and way of interacting with that change, but it maybe wasn't necessarily sufficient or fast enough to meet the challenges we were facing. So organisations, innovation teams like the jHub were stood up to pilot and see if there was a different way to interact and engage with defence, commercial sector, as well as explore as we could accelerate some of the solutions that were being developed in the commercial sector and bring them back into defence at pace. So what we started to do was the main focus of the mission set was to focus on rapidly identifying and exploiting mature solutions to our users' problems. So we deliberately set ourselves for that pilot a relatively high TRL level. One, because we felt there was low tech risk and high impact, and you can give that to a user at pace in their native environment, and they can start to play with that technology and concept as well. The team was made up, what I've sort of inherited was a mixture of military and civilian as well. So military from all different backgrounds, as well as some civilians from different backgrounds as well. No magic powers, no magic sauce, but I think what it's shown is the value of having a really dedicated team that has taken time to invest understanding of users' problems, the users themselves and their needs, the requirements of current and future operations, how defence works, how defence procurement works, how commercial works, how finance works, such that when a user has a problem but they don't know how to get to a solution, they've now got some dedicated people that can help provide and facilitate that relationship.
And how much of it is, as it were, demand pull from potential users, and how much of it is thematic, which is to say, we think we need to be in this area, and whether we've got any customers or not. How do you balance those two?
Yeah, so the majority of the portfolio is user pull. And the reason there's a couple of reasons we've done that, and I always leave this open to discussion. Others in the jHub will have a different view on this as well, but we all agree it's user pull. One, because the user understands the problems. The user is in the fight now. And I don't necessarily mean the user who's always right at the pointy end. I mean the user that could well be doing the logistics or supply bit as well. The user understands the problem. They have a need and a demand. And I think they add to that momentum and desire and pull through. We talked about adoption earlier. If we were to deliver some long-term project, well, that user would probably have changed job. And in fact, we might have had 2 users in that time frame. The need and necessity might have waned. In addition, the current situation and the demand, conflict is happening at a tremendous pace. Technology is happening at a tremendous pace. Again, that demand starts to go away. So I think there's been a natural lean towards focusing on user, one, because of need, but actually sort of the necessity and reality of defence says that's where you get most value from as well. That's not to say we haven't pivoted some of the portfolio towards thematic or what you might define as innovation push as well, sort of a traditional 70, 20, 10% model.
What do the recent announcements by the government mean for jHub and defence innovation more broadly?
Yeah, exciting and positive. Yeah, no, we're hoping really positive. I think we'll all openly admit the sort of current, how you might define the current defence innovation ecosystem, in particular the innovation hubs, is they've kind of grown and sort of spurted up organically. And there is a need now to somehow better configure and align them to make them more effective and efficient as well. And that's really what I think UKDI is going to try and do in the first instance. How does it better join up and connect to the current innovation hubs to the broader defence innovation ecosystem as well? And that in turn should, I think, simplify the defence innovation ecosystem for the UK supplier and European supplier market as well. It will give us a clear identity and brand as well. Whether we'll be branded under a single title or retain our individual status, that's to be determined. It should give us, I think, one of the sort of key things that I'm looking for and I'm pushing for it to have is really those key support elements and those enablers. So access to commercial support, access to funding, and access to technological SMEs as well. It's those key enablers that allow my project managers to get on and deliver at pace, and those are the things in high demand. So how can they provide those down to us in the services? We've got access to users. We just need that additional capacity to get after problems at pace. And then I think the key bit is it's obviously going to come with funding, ring-fence funding, which is going to grow as well. And I think what we're all hoping for is an element of that funding that is ring-fenced for the equipment programme and procurement. So it is money that will be uncommitted. One of the big challenges we have is we'll deliver an innovation. I think everyone agrees the value has been delivered, and there is now a clear demand signal, and we've worked out what the integration pathway is. But hey, guess what? We might have to wait 1 or 2 years to get it onto a balance of investment or fit it into an ABC cycle. So we need to create some financial agility and flexibility to adopt it much quicker.
There's obviously it will have to operate across the entire breadth of the technology readiness levels. I'm presuming some of this new hub will be focused right down at the beginning, the early stage. One of the interesting things that I've found in speaking to particularly SMEs is a lack of understanding generally in UK policymaking of the middle bit, the technology readiness levels 4 to 7 as we call them, where you're going towards prototype. You're thinking about the way it will be manufactured, not just what will the product look like. And I'm wondering, what does this new body need to do there? What can it do? Not so much for here's a new thing we've invented for you to go have an effect on the battlefield. But here's a new industrial process that we've invented to make sure we can make thousands of them at once. What light can you either of you throw really on what we need to do about that?
I think since you took that question a slightly different way to I expected, but if you talk about the technology for how we build things and how we design things, how we design, develop, build, deliver, that for me falls right in the sweet spot of those underlying technologies. And there are digital engineering capabilities that we need to adopt and get much faster at. There's challenges in there around the data sensitivity management and the security of how we manage that. If you look at the latest kind of AI engineering tools, generative AI development of software, all of these things allow us to accelerate massively. But they do come with risks, and they do come with those cyber challenges that we talked about. And we do need to have adequate boundaries around how we can do those to ensure that those things are done in a safe and resilient way. I think manufacturing technologies are going to be huge, particularly around those flexible scaling technologies. So how do you build one thing one week and another thing the next week? And I think a lot of that will sit in a broader industrial base that we all need to develop and work on pulling through. Yeah,
just to add to that, and completely agree, it's those conditions. What are the additional conditions and sort of environments that we can create that bring those in the sort of the prototype stage and the user together? Ideally, physically co-locate them at the moment. We are somewhat fortunate in an unfortunate way to benefit from Ukraine at the moment as a real-time live battle lab. How do we create those conditions back here in the UK? Not just physically, but as you said, with the right permissions, policies and regulations and the funding that allow that development to take place. And I think that would have a huge impact if we can deliver against that.
I guess another angle we could look into is how do we move from a promising new technology, which we feel would be relevant, to make it a widely used and applicable technology, which can be immediately put to use if need be?
Yeah, so I think the first element of that is, when do we consider something a promising new technology? There's a real tendency to take an engineering view of that. If I have a widget that can do a thing that I wasn't able to do before, I think really, and that's important, and that innovation we want to foster, but that's to then the point of getting it in users' hands quickly, understanding what problem does it solve, understanding how it can be used, and getting that feedback as early in the design cycle as possible as to what the thing is that will be adopted widely. Because there's two elements to that wide-scale adoption. One is, can we make a lot of it? The other is, will users use a lot of it? And we've got to run those two things in parallel. Otherwise we'll end up with a lot of something that someone doesn't want to use, or we'll end up with a brilliant thing that everyone's crying out for and no one can build it. So how we bring that innovation, and that's where some of the engagements we have with Ukrainian industry, and understand how they are working literally hand in glove with their operational units, and that feedback cycle is daily. This is the mission I did last night, this worked, this didn't work, can you make it do that please? That kind of collaboration and closeness of relationship, I think is going to be critical. And for me, I think we've seen real strides forwards in the last few years around the intent of viewing the UK defence industrial enterprise, combining both the operational services and the defence industrial base as an entity that is there to move forwards capability. And the closer we can build those relationships and the closer we can iterate those capabilities, I think the greater our ability will be to, one, identify what is genuinely promising, and then scale both its manufacture and its adoption.
Yeah, and I just build on that collaboration point, because I think it's really important, because that collaboration will probably need to be with industry and small medium enterprises, because where you're looking at those emerging technologies, but maybe the priority drive or pool isn't there, we're absolutely dependent and reliant on industry, private capital, venture investment. Maybe that's where, especially from that dual purpose angle, how can we give them a strong enough indication that defence will need this at some point, but we're not quite yet have the capacity and readiness to take it. how can you step in and provide that crucial funding and investment to pull that technology or that new capability forward?
And it's a problem that innovation on its own doesn't solve. It's something that has to be managed as a kind of whole government and industrial strategy piece, in the sense that I don't know whether you have the experience of this, of just the VCs will always say defence is too small, so we don't invest in early stage. Private equity, suddenly there are people with moral and ethical considerations sitting on boards of investment funds, and before you know it, no matter how much you push dual use as a solution to defence's problems, it becomes somebody else's problem, and they don't want to hear the words. How do we overcome that?
I think we've seen a real shift in that, particularly the ESG kind of considerations and investor willingness. You're seeing massive venture investment going into, particularly some of the US angels, the kind of the Andurils of the world, the emerging disruptors as they would badge themselves. You're seeing a real shift in the venture capital willingness to invest in this space, especially when it's a dual use. Because the UK defence market is too small to get VCs excited. The global defence market, or the Western defence market, less so. But there is absolutely that attractiveness where there is a wider commercial use case that we can use. And for me, the sea change has been the investor community is much more willing to engage in that than maybe a couple of years ago or pre-Ukraine. So I think that's a real shift that isn't something we necessarily need to overcome. I just think the context and environment of the world has changed, so people's mindsets are naturally moving in a way that helps us.
We see that almost weekly. There's significant interest from the venture capital community now, much more willingness to engage, and I think there's now a requisite of us actually to get better at engaging with them, understanding their language, understanding their ways of working, and we've looked at a couple of things where we can start to put people into venture capital and venture investment firms for short periods to start to understand the language, their ways of working, their ways of thinking.
Well, it's almost time to end our conversation, but I would like to end with an interesting question. So in your view, Dan and Rob, what will be the top 3 key transformative defence innovations in the upcoming decade?
I think that's a tough one. I think that's a tough one because I always sort of cop out with this answer for my team that context is always king, and the nature of the operating environment and the challenges we face will determine which is the most important. And then I think there's a combination of technologies and capabilities. But if I was to pin my hat on it, I think quantum, when it comes to position, navigation, sense and timing. I think cyber and encrypted communication scalability, what's truly secret these days is going to remain critical as well. And then I might cheat and say AI and autonomy as one, but I understand they are separate, but I think we see how closely aligned they are in some of the capabilities we operate as well.
I know I'm the tech guy in the room, but I'll take a very different slant on that. If you look at innovation as that problem-centric development of capability, just go back to the fundamentals of what do we mean by innovation. If we get it right, I think the most impactful innovation will be shifting how the defence industrial base and our operational commands work together.
Yeah, 100%.
And if we can get the speed of learning and the speed of relevance, so we can apply all of the technology innovation that industry can bring, but tailor it and apply it to the real operational need statements and those real problem statements and fundamentally shift that understanding, then if we can do that in a way that allows us to do the rapid iteration, but also in a way that allows us to take the 1 and the 2 and the 3 year view in parallel as to what are the things that will take longer to develop, but we will be really glad in 3 years' time that we started 3 years ago. If we can do that for me will be transformational.
This is fascinating. Paul, I think we will need to organise the second part of this conversation to be recorded in the upcoming months.
Yes, and it's something where you're always left at the end of this thinking, if only we could talk concrete. We could only put one of the machines or the electromagnetic spectrum could be illustrated in front of us, but we can't. So our viewers and listeners will just have to imagine it
Rob, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. And this is Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage. And you can find all our episodes on our website. Thank you so much for listening, and until